another dive into the Moro assassination. This is from 1998, so 20 years after the event, after the terrible crime was committed. We revisit a period when the truth is threatening to break out again. But as we now understand, this could never happen and hasn't happened to this day, because I'd been looking at videos coming out on YouTube around the date of the 9th, addressing the Aldo Moro kidnapping murder of Aldo Moro. And they were all taking this very safe, mainstream line, which was that it was still a mystery. It's still shrouded in mystery. We don't know who was behind it. Oh my God, we may never know. And I think we're seeing the same thing going on with the Kennedy assassination, with RFK Jr. coming out and saying publicly, it's supposed to be this big disclosure. The CIA was behind the Kennedy assassination. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's a limited hangout. My understanding, and I'll stand by this, is that it was an MI6 operation. The CIA has always been a spin-off of MI6 and was simply doing the bidding of the masters the only masters CIA ever has respected, which is the Privy Council. And so, not surprised to have, seeing the videos coming out around the 9th about Aldo Moro, same thing. No mention at all of, certainly not of the British, nor any mention of Kissinger. So the lid's back on. So the kind of sentiment that's expressed at the end of this article is a bit tragic, because as we see, the truth was never able to break out and has not broken out even today, 25 years later. So, interesting lesson for us all. We've got to push harder. Okay, April 3rd, 1998. Controversy breaks out in Italy over British role in Moro assassination by the always reliable and very tuned in source Claudio Celani. "20 years ago, on March 16th, 1978, a terrorist commando squad kidnapped Italian political leader Aldo Moro, chairman of the Christian Democracy, D.C. He was killed after 55 days' imprisonment. The assassination is the most dramatic political murder in Italy's recent history, but although the Red Brigade's terrorists who carried out the kidnapping and murder were arrested, tried, and sentenced, the case is still unsolved. An animated debate has now broken out over the question of who pulled the strings of the assassins and why. Not by chance, Lyndon LaRouche's views on the case have been prominently featured. Aldo Moro was the architect of a, quote, national solidarity government for Italy, a project that was supposed to include Italy's largest opposition party, the Italian Communist Party, PCI, on the condition that it split from Moscow. Cooperation between the pro-industrial factions of the PCI and the DC would have enabled Italy to become a bridge for the development of the Middle East and Africa, as envisioned by industrialist Enrico Mattei in the 1950s and 60s. And we recall that Mattei had very close working relationship and visionary similarities with President Kennedy. And we know that Allen Dulles was known to ridicule Kennedy's aspirations and plans for Africa and for the world that was not yet developed, and calling it messianic globaloney. And the CIA went behind Kennedy's back at every opportunity to defeat, thwart, sabotage Kennedy's designs, because CIA actually works for the empire and always has. Was set up by the damn empire. Such a shift, however, was anathema to the British oligarchy, which deployed what was referred to as a, quote, strategy of tension. Should be familiar to those who know anything about Operation Gladio. Gladio means a sword in Italian, using both left and right wing terrorism to destabilize the Italian nation. The LaRouche movement, including its representatives in Italy, known at that time as the European Labour Party, POE, ran a campaign to expose the role of the British and their assets. In October 1978, the POE published a book, Who Killed Aldo Moro, which charged, quote, the backbone of Italian destabilization is the feudal and oligarchical aristocracy, which shares a common worldview and an identification with the British Crown and other monarchies. It is a faction that has never accepted industrial capitalism, hates scientific progress, and aims to establish a world system in which they will be allowed to express all their bestiality. They look at the United States and the USSR as temporary agencies destined to be balkanized and taken over. So we see certainly Putin mounting significant resistance to this. We see in the States the plan seems to be rolling ahead with the removal of Trump. There seems to be nothing standing in the way. I'd like to add just here that I think there is a third strain, if you will, a third philosophical strain or vision within Middle European aristocratic circles, that while which is critical, certainly, of industrial capitalism, but does not hate scientific progress per se, and certainly would never, and is by its very nature fundamentally spiritually what can you say? I'm trying to choose the right word. Certainly does not countenance the kind of brutal exploitation that we've seen under British administration, under British monarchical administration of the empire. There is another voice, there is another vision, what I call a third way, through which I've encountered through personal contacts, and I'd like to be able to elucidate that at some later date, not too far off in the future, but I've kind of encountered it on my last trip to Vienna, which I find to hold out hope. It's a vision that sees the health of the human being, healthy food, healthy. I don't want to use the word sustainable because it's technocratic, but wants to preserve the older, the ancient, in fact, techniques and of food production that are deeply rooted in cultural identity for Middle Europeans, and preserve the integrity of the platform of life that all human beings depend upon ultimately, and that I tend to agree with them that industrial capitalism compromises this essential platform. I understand that it seems to bring hope, it seems to bring development, it seems to foster a kind of unbridled optimism, but I think ultimately it's dangerous in the way that it proceeds with a lack of sensitivity toward the earth and toward human nature and toward the deeper sources of our culture. So I'll just leave it at that. I certainly am not going to be drawn into any sort of, left-right discussion or this or that dialectic polemics. I'm really talking about something that would be brand new to a lot of people. All right. The British geopolitical destabilization made use of an intricate web of intelligence agents and political assets, including former U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, and a motley assortment of Italian Freemasons. For example, an effective police search of Moro's prison was sabotaged by the Interior Minister Francesco Cossiga, a British agent who had put in place a, quote, crisis committee, which made sure that all clues that could have led to Moro's liberation were suppressed or disregarded. In 1981, it was discovered that the crisis committee, quote unquote, was controlled by the Propaganda Due, P2 Freemasonic Lodge affiliated with the Scottish Rite. And in my understanding, the P2 was founded at the behest of, under the direction or the orders of the Duke of Kent, who oversees Freemasonry globally. Moro's policy collapsed with the elimination of its author, although a national solidarity government led by Giulio Andreotti lasted for 2 more years without Moro. Factional struggles and external manipulation prevailed over higher national interests. So that's characteristic of what we're seeing in the United States, certainly. Higher national interests are verboten. And what's happening in the United States is entirely, the United States is sort of, I call it a zombie democracy. That democracies by their very nature are easily manipulated, which is why the word republic has been swapped out for the word democracy, which isn't mentioned in the founding documents of the United States. So we have a democracy where people are voting according to absolute, just pure brainwashing, not understanding the underlying causes of what's happening around them. Just, it's all very hormonal, but it's being mechanistically manipulated by the masters in Geneva, in the city of London. Limited sovereignty going on. With that historical background in mind, consider the fact that on March 17th, 1998, the Milan daily Il Giornale, owned by opposition leader Silvio Berlusconi, ran a front-page article by Renato Farina citing the POE's 20-year-old book on the Moro assassination. The author, who disagrees with analysis in the book, uses it to attack the views expressed only 2 days earlier by the current chairman of the Italian parliament, Luciano Violante, a former prosecutor and influential member of the PDS party, the post-communist successor to the PCI, and a member of the current ruling coalition. Violante, in an interview with the Turin daily La Stampa, had stated that the real truth about the Moro case has never come out because the convicted terrorists always refuse to collaborate with the investigators. I think that they can be seen as just absolutely top specimens in terms of brainwashed assets. So there's no way you're going to crack these these nuts. However, Violante is convinced that the Moro murder and other terrorist acts have to be considered a case of surrogate warfare among states, quote unquote. Violante added that, quote, all the conditions existed for a role of foreign secret services in the Moro case. Quote, Italy was a country with limited sovereignty, with slight legitimacy on an international level. In that phase, many international analysts thought that terrorism could be, quote, surrogate warfare, which we know now certainly is. By limited sovereignty, Violante was referring to the veto often imposed by the British through NATO or American channels against the participation of a party such as the PCI, a co-drafter of Italy's constitution, in any government coalition. Violante asked, who was sovereign at that time, politics or the bureaucracy? I do not know whether somebody in the institution said Moro must die. I do know that a successful drive to free Moro was not put into motion. In fact, Violante said that the heads of the secret services and many members of the Crisis Management Committee belonged to the Propaganda Due Lodge. Quote, is a circumstance that did not favor the liberation of Moro. The P2 Lodge had different political aims than Moro, and since for a P2 member, Freemasonic loyalty must prevail over institutional loyalty, the consequence is that a loyal P2 member must not liberate Moro, unquote. Violante noted an episode which has implications for the current situation. Quote, the greatest mystery in the behavior of state authorities is the Via Gradoli story, unquote. This refers to a terrorist safe house which was known to the police, but for reasons never clarified was not searched. See accompanying interview with Sergio Flamini. Violante attacked then Interior Minister and Supreme Police Chief Francesco Cossiga, an enemy of Moro who made a career for himself after Moro's murder. Cossiga became Prime Minister 2 years after Moro's death and was eventually elected president. On orders, on orders from London, Cossiga promoted in 1992 a Jacobin anti-corruption investigation which destroyed Italy's traditional political parties, including the Christian Democracy, and which still keeps Parliament under blackmail. Currently, Cossiga is building up a new party which is supposed to help destroy parliamentary alliances and drive the country toward further Jacobin chaos with the ultimate aim of overthrowing the constitution. The fact that Violante decided to attack Cossiga is therefore of the utmost importance. However, it will come to nothing if the British role is not fully exposed. Unfortunately, Violante represents a faction which is itself being manipulated by the British into thinking that the Americans are responsible for Italy's destabilization, including the Moro murder, which I'm sure Kissinger is only too happy to participate in that and contribute to that deception which goes on even today. The idea that the Americans are the world leaders and the British are sort of relegated to the Museum of History and come out occasionally to support the Americans. This is absolutely a false understanding, one that's promoted for obvious reasons. Partly this confusion, because the British are doing as a force of this global empire, which I would argue is based in Geneva, is certainly very active in causing the collapse of the United States. And over the past several decades has portrayed the Americans as leading the charge in all of these projects, which I would argue that the United States was subject. It was a coup. It was a coup d'état back on November 20th, 1963, Kennedy's assassination. At this point, you see the country taken over completely. Became completely an instrument of the empire that pretends not to exist. So we see the same thing going back. The Americans being represented as leading this destabilization campaign in Italy. Partly this confusion comes from the prominent role of such British assets as Kissinger, who, as is well known, threatened Moro in 1976, warning him that his national solidarity policy was dangerous. Of course, the argument was, Kissinger was saying it's dangerous, implying it's dangerous to Italy, but of course the real message was to Moro that it was dangerous for himself, Moro, to pursue it. Because strong nations are really an impediment to imperial will. But the confusion is also due to an element of Jacobinism that characterizes Violante's faction, which prompts them to consider Moro's party, the Christian democracy, as a traitor to national interests. In reaction to this radical posture, representatives of the Christian democratic tradition, the DC no longer exists, defend both the party and the United States by denying that there ever was a string puller behind the Red Brigades. Of course, absurd. In this way, each faction is being manipulated into quarreling impotently with the others, which you certainly see that in the United States now. Although I would say it's more homogenous. More homogenous, with rhinos basically merging for all intents and purposes with the Bolsheviks. Il Giornale deputy editor Farina, for example, belongs to a group of former Christian Democrats who have fallen into the trap of denying a political conspiracy to kill Moro. Probably without intending to do so, he let the cat out of the bag. In his article, starting from the front page with the title Queen Elizabeth on Via Fani, and jumping to an inside page with the headline, The Red Brigades on orders from Her Majesty, Farina brings up the POA's book, which I should like to find and download and perhaps read it. I'm sure it would be fascinating. Again, not because I'm some kind of curator of historical minutiae. No, I think this is vitally important to understand. I still tactically, in terms of research that can bring us up to speed to the point where we can take meaningful action, I think my instinct is that this is vital to understand, to take apart these events of a few decades back, because we can discover so much about the present in this way. That's my personal opinion. Excuse me, I have a really actually bad cold, in case you haven't noticed. We trace back, Farina writes, we trace back the literary precedent, the political brother, maybe the moral clone of Chairman Violante. It is the European Labour Party, domestic branch of the American millionaire LaRouche. The POE goes after Britain, and especially after Queen Elizabeth, besides Kissinger and the Knights of Malta. They even bring documents to support it. Perhaps Violante does not refer to the Queen, but to Kissinger for sure. Unquote. While Farina's intent is sarcastic, the fact is that the role of Kissinger and his London masters is now back on the front pages of the Italian press, and, as the accompanying interview shows, there are some political leaders today who are not afraid of telling the truth, If Italy is to survive as a nation, that comes not a moment too soon. And again, reminding everyone, this article is 20 years old at this point, and from what I've seen coming out on the 45th anniversary of Moro's death, no indication that the truth has come out. No mention of Kissinger, certainly no mention of the British Crown, no mention of Queen Elizabeth. None of this. It's all been neutralized with this sort of sensational interpretation of events as if it's some kind of unsolvable, eternal mystery. So let's just look up here for a second. Who killed Aldo Moro? The Italian daily Il Giornale features a book issued by the LaRouche movement in 1978 titled Who Killed Aldo Moro, in which the role of Henry Kissinger and the British oligarchy was investigated. And I would say, I don't want to blackpill anyone, that investigation has not gone nowhere. It's still underway for those of us who won't give up. And so